name right, sir.
Good. Yeah, it's my name is Martin Carcasson. Martin Carcasson. Or Argentina. That's why it's Martin. And thank I know y'all been here for a long day already, so I really appreciate the time that you're giving to the school district, and I'll kind of take us home here for the next 45 minutes or hour or so. I'm going to throw a lot of ideas at you, and kind of get you going. Feel free to kind of stop me and ask kind of questions as we go, but I'm going to try to get through most of the material and still have some time there at the end. I work a lot with John, pretty easy to get me to come back if you want to ask some questions, and I tend to come back at the end of the year as well to kind of open it up as we go. I have a longer version of this presentation online as well. So some of the things if you want to dig deeper into and things like that, John can kind of send you that link if you like. But I am a communication professor. I've been at CSU a little over 10 years now, and 7 years ago I started an organization called the Center for Public Deliberation, which basically serves as an impartial resource for the Northern Colorado community. I train undergraduates, so this is actually one of the meetings that we ran. This is with the Senior Center in Fort Collins. We had about 100 people in the room at tables. These are two of my students, so one of them is facilitating, one of them is note-taking, kind of capturing the discussion. They're trained both as facilitators generally, but then also trained on that specific kind of project on, like a facilitation plan to really kind of engage the community and help the community really talk about the issue. Right? This presentation I give, another kind of a title I often give it, is what kind of talk does democracy need? And the basic point of what I'll be talking about today is this notion that democracy requires pretty high quality communication. Democracy is tough, right? But we tend not to get it. Right? I don't know if many of y'all would disagree with me or not, but the quality of our political communication, leaves a little bit to be desired, right? We're not having the kind of conversations we need to have. So a big part of the work that I do is, how do we increase the capacity of our communities to be able to have these kind of problems? Have these kind of conversations and to engage these problems, right? And I think part of the reason John keeps on bringing me back to saying Vrain is what happens when you have a broader and broader group of community members, of parents that get it, that approach problems from a broader perspective. So I'm not here to tell you how to think at all, right? And John, at the end, they're not going to creating you as advocates for the school district, right? They're wanting you to be people that understand the kind of complexity of issues, so then can be kind of a key resource as we move forward. So the work that I do, and I am a tenured professor, so I've got research responsibilities, but I'm also, we run about 5 or 6 big projects in the community, so I'm very much a practitioner, right? The term they're using now is an academic, that I do both. So hopefully I'm not too much of just a boring college lecture, but a lot of the stuff that we do has been built off experience in the last 7 years of running these events and trying to help people have difficult conversations. But the 2 questions that I deal with in my research is, how do we best address public problems in a diverse democracy? And what kind of communication or engagement processes help us do that? How do we talk to each other? How do we engage each other to best deal with these problems? And part of what came up, the planner left, I'd be curious what he thought about this, but there's an article that was written, 1973, so quite a long time ago, I was one, that were written by engineers, by planners, right? They got trained in universities and they got hired by cities to work as a city planner. And they found out pretty quickly that the kind of problems they were dealing with in their job were very different than the kind of problems they were dealing with that they were trained to deal with, right? They were trained to deal with Tame problems. And Tame problem might not be an easy problem. It could be a very complex problem, right? But it's a problem that there is a technical answer to, right? That the more experts study the problem, the more they inherently converge and kind of come in. And Tame problems, you can kind of divide them up into their pieces and study them in pieces and kind of put them back together, right? And the main value for solving a Tame problem is efficiency. How can we best solve this problem with as few as resources, whether that's time, money, or people, or things, right? But they said, we're not dealing that much with these Tame problems, we're dealing with wicked problems. And a wicked problem, I'm going to highlight about 5 aspects of the wicked problem, but focus on this first one, right? Wicked problems inherently involve competing underlying values, paradoxes, and trade-offs that cannot be resolved by science. That means that the heart of the issue, right, is that different people want different things. And the more we get of some things we want, the more we get of some things that we don't want. Or the more we get rid of something we don't want, we also get rid of something we want. And that's the conversations we need to have. I'm going to try to kind of bring this up. So here's one example of a project that we did a few years ago. Now, I've presented this slide probably about 40 times over the last 4 years. has a completely different meaning this time, after all the floods, right? But generally, we don't have enough water in northern Colorado, right? So it creates tensions, right? Where I'm from in Fort Collins, we don't get that much rain, right? We get a whole bunch of water, typically in May and June. Most of it kind of goes on by. But over the last 100 years that we've created reservoirs and we've created ditches and irrigations, we got more water from the western slope and so forth, right? So we built up this agricultural community that in some ways shouldn't really be here because there's not enough water for it, right? But then you add to that 100 years of being a really nice place to live and more people coming. And a really nice place to brew beer, right? So more breweries coming. And County particularly a pretty nice place to find natural gas, and they need water too. So all these new kind of needs for water, and it created this conflict. So we were approached by the Northern Colorado Community Foundation and the Water Institute to say, you know what, water's going to become more and more of an issue for our community. We need to know how to talk about it. And most of the talking about it was people talking past each other, right? Nasty letters to the editor and those kind of things. So the point that I'm making here, if you look at these 9 boxes, if you take them one at a time, are there any bad things in there? One at a time, there's nothing bad, right? The problem is, as we seek for some of them, right? We seek some of them, they kind of push back. There's tension. There's inherent tensions in there, right? But the philosophical point that's kind of the basis of my work is, generally, we all actually have the same values. There's not that many people that just have bad values, right? The issue is that we rank our values differently. And those rankings have some pretty big differences, right? We started this project when we engaged the community. We did a lot of education first, but then when we actually ran the deliberative events, we started off by saying, you know what? No one's anti-river, right? There's no one out there that's like, dang, river, right? Again, changing with the last couple of weeks, but generally, the problem isn't that some people just inherently are anti-river, right? It's that they put other things in front of the river, right? And that's the conversation we need to have. But most of the conversation, most of the communication we get is experts live within these boxes, and typically advocates and activists live within these boxes, right? And they're framing things as, hey, I'm for this value, anyone against me is against this value, right? Again, the issue generally, and that isn't that much that people are against values. The conversation we need to have is, how do we negotiate these values? What's the best way to do this, right? And there are better and worse ways to do that, but that's the communication that we need to struggle with. So this is a brand new one. This isn't in your. I was supposed to pass this out. I've got the PowerPoint. Sorry. Yeah, don't know. And then we also have, this is one just a little short article of mine. I'll mention a little later. So your PowerPoint doesn't have every single slide, but it has all the kind of main slides. No, it doesn't have this one because I added this one this morning. This is a current project we're working on, kind of same thing. Right, we're working with a few different communities on local food and how do we deal with food, and food's a wicked problem, right? Again, every single one of these boxes, taken one at a time, is a good thing, right? The problem is those boxes don't fit very well together, and some people are very passionate about some of the boxes and kind of focus on that. Right? But the conversations that as we move forward, we're going to talk about food a little bit, kind of like we talk about energy. That it is a political issue inherently, right? And where are we getting it from, and how do we deal with this, and how do we help people? So part of the process, I won't spend too much time on it, but we can design a process. Okay, which of these are most important to you, right? Which of these do you have good information on when you're making decisions, right? Which tensions between these do you potentially struggle with? How do we best negotiate the tensions? How can we best educate other people to negotiate the tensions better? Make better choices. What's the role of government in kind of helping us negotiate those things? So that's kind of processes we can do. It goes back to the heart of it, what I already kind of mentioned is, a value by definition is a good thing, right? The first rule of values is when taking one at a time and abstractly, we're all pro those values, right? If you talk about the key American values of freedom, justice, equality, safety, anyone against any of those things? But we frame it so much as if we support these values, and people against us are against them. It's probably they're putting another value, they're focusing on another value, and that creates a conversation we need to have, but we tend not to have. So this is one I started with, and we could spend all day on this, and maybe we'll come back and play with a little bit more. But K-12 is a wicked problem, right? Again, all these things in the middle, I think most people taking one at a time are good things, right? There's a lot of inherent tensions here, right? There's a lot of inherent tensions just on what do we spend our time on in the school day, right? And how long should the school day be, and how long should the school calendar be? Clearly, there's always going to be tensions in the use of resources and where we're going to put them. But then there's also just inherent tensions. One of the things I'm really starting to study is the tension between here, right? I mean, clear usefulness of having really good data, right? To compare and see what's working and those type of things. But really good data takes a lot of time to gather. Really good data requires consistency, right? And both of those things tend to, not inherently, but tend to work against creativity and innovation, right? We want local control, we want the teacher to have control, but we also want, there's some really good tensions there that we need to talk about. And we engage those issues, but again, we typically talk past each other. So that's just one example, but we could pull out 10, or even from my perspective, we want efficient decision making, right? We want good leaders, but we also want engaged and informed public. Democracy's not efficient, right? Democracy is designed to be inefficient. So there's a tension. We helped PSD, the Coop School District, with their superintendent hire, and we did a big survey. Half the people on the survey said, we need a big, strong leader that will just make the tough decisions. And the other half said, we need a collaborator that will listen to our voices. Both good things. Don't fit together very well, right? The issue isn't whether you want a strong leader or a weak leader, right? Or a collaborator or someone who just doesn't listen to anybody. Well, you want both, but they won't fit together. And that's the conversation we need to have. So that's the first one I really wanted to nail down, right? I know it took a lot of time for that one. Is most tough issues, it's about competing underlying values, and we tend not to spend too much time thinking about those. That's not how our minds work. That's not how activist groups work. That's not how Facebook page groups work. We've got all these mechanisms to gather around people that think like us and narrow the focus and focus on it. I don't want to quite say simplistic, but a narrow kind of range of issues. Right? And it's very unnatural for us to open it up like that. But for us to really improve the district, we ought to be a great resource for improving the quality of the district. The more people kind of see things through those lenses. Still be an advocate, right? But just not an advocate, open your frame a little bit more, right? A couple other quick things I'll just touch on and I can get back into more a little bit more. But proposed solution to a wicked problem tends to create new problems. Wicked problems are systemic, right? So you can focus on one of those boxes and put a lot of energy and resources in one of those boxes and make some really kind of good advances on one of those boxes, but inherently you're going to get some trade-offs on the other side, right? So you don't solve a wicked problem. Right? We're never going to find the perfect balance between justice and freedom and security and equality in our society. Right? You can find better or worse ways, but it's going to be a constant conversation. Right? This is particularly important to K-12. Wicked problems, so optimal solutions to wicked problems require adaptive changes, require people to change their behavior. Right? I think it was great when Don kind of talked about, school size class size is important, right? But quality of the teacher and the quality of the student and how hard the student works and the quality of the parent engagement are huge. Schools don't have that much control over lots of those things, right? We can control school size, class size somewhat, and somewhat teacher effectiveness, but that's kind of hard to define. We're all fighting about, right? But parent engagement and student engagement, right? Parents and students don't change their behavior based on a memo from the superintendent, right? So the more you engage people in processes, you can't just have experts in the room figuring out the best way to deal with these tensions. You need to engage the public, right? Because then not only do you get broader voices engaged in it, but you also get more ownership on the back end. There's plenty of examples and case studies that kind of show this with tough issues. The experts in the back room might come up with a solution, and we actually engage the people. New solutions come out that not only are innovative, that the experts might not think of, right? But since they came up with it, they take ownership of it and support it. And then wicked problems necessitates effective collaboration and communication across multiple perspectives. This goes back to the quality of our current political communication. We don't talk to each other across perspectives, right? It's not natural, and there's just not mechanisms for it, right? But to understand wicked problems, you need to hear from people from different perspectives, because it's just so easy to assume their motives, right? Assume they hate rivers, right? And those type of things. So you need this broad collaboration, which means we need processes, we need institutions, we need capacity to have those conversations. As we'll get into as I move forward, most ways that we engage each other, right, are not that way. We're not set up for collaboration. We got lots of mechanisms for people to express their voice. We have very few mechanisms for people to actually listen to each other. And that's what we need to change. And the good news for people in this district is with John and with Don, you're one of the most innovative districts in the country in terms of engaging people better, right? and not just doing the traditional one at a time at the microphone, traditional email, traditional letters to the editor, those type of things, just everyone talking back to one another. And then last, we could problems require creativity, innovation, imagination. We need, once we realize the complexity, the tensions, it's when it's good versus evil, when it's just one simple value, the solution's simple, right? Just get rid of the evil, right? I always go back to kind of blaming Disney here. I've got a 13-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 3-year-old. I watch a lot of Disney movies, right? Most Disney movies, good versus evil, right? And it's not only good versus evil, but it's like knowingly evil, right? They're just dark, they have bad motives, they want to destroy, so I think we train all our kids on all tough issues. It's just a good one and a bad one. You just got to get rid of the bad one, right? Most issues aren't like that, right? Most issues are some tough ones. The problem is when we get to the tough ones, it's not as simple, right? But when we get to the tough ones, once people understand each other, once they realize it's not so simple, that's when you can start getting creative. That's when you figure out ways, what's the best way to balance these values? How can we transcend these values and get one way? How can we kind of do both at the same time? But I think we have so much capacity for that innovation, we waste so much of our creativity on just like making the other side look bad, right? Versus using all that innovation to figure out how to do it. So that's kind of the key to better process. So when you look at democracy, we need democracy to work. We need, we need experts. We need good information. We need good data, right? We obviously need the public if we're going to be legitimate. In democracy, at some point, the public has some control over the rules that govern them. But they also, because of the need for adaptive change, that the public needs to be involved because typically it's their behavior that's implicated, right? We can't just automatically change them. And obviously, we need the decision makers involved. They have the bigger levers of change. So the work that I do is here in the middle of trying to get these all to talk to each other, right? The work that you do, you'll probably be over here, right? But it'll be interesting how often you drift into here. How often in a meeting, instead of just fighting for your perspective, you realize, you know what, we're shutting out a voice here, right? We're leaving something out. We've got the blinders on. And to what degree, this is what I really work with my students just in general, even if they're not going to be facilitators the rest of their life, is to what degree are you not just there to convince people of your opinion, but you're there to elevate the level of conversation overall. And to ask good questions and to make space for different perspectives, because then the decision will be better instead of just your decision. We'll get into that when we look at adversarial processes, is you might win in the short term, but it's not sustainable if you win kind of big short term. Now, when you look at that from a K-12 perspective, it gets a little bit more complicated, right? And I even included students and parents in the same bubble, which obviously, do you and your students kind of different opinion on how schools should work? Yeah. It's just doing the 5 circles on a Venn diagram is harder, right? So I just kind of put that, I cheated a little bit. But then you also have, these other big major kind of functions, and obviously, recently a lot of changes to K-12 from the state government that's coming down. This is another way of seeing K-12 as a wicked problem. If I asked y'all to get a piece of paper out and write, okay, define student success for each of these groups, would we get some different answers? Lots of different answers, right? Each answer individually would probably be pretty good, right? But figuring out how to make all those groups happy by achieving their definition of success at the same time, it's pretty wicked. Right? So as I've been going through, I've been touching on this already. But one way to think about this, and the work that we do, is there's like 3 basic ways of thinking about how to solve public problems. And when I use the word politics, I'm starting to get rid of the word politics because I just have so many different meanings, right? But think of politics as just how we solve problems together. So the adversarial model is the dominant model in lots of ways, right? Whether that's Democrats and Republicans, or whether that's just activist groups, or however, that's people that have an opinion and focus on mobilizing people to their side and kind of push change through, right? I've taught social movements class, I've taught persuasion class. I have a lot of respect for sometimes that's the way change happens, right? But it can also be over-applied, so we'll get into. Right? The second model is the expert model, right? Saying, you know what, these problems are difficult, the public can't understand it, or the public doesn't have time, or they're not interested. We need kind of the expert to kind of figure out the best way. Both of the, when I started this 10 years ago, I was more the bad, good, right? Kind of had my own little blinders on, right? The more I do this, the more I realize each has pros and cons, and a community or an organization or a school or a district needs to have viable resources in all 3, right? What I'm really kind of seeing now is the better you do this, when this is done well, it brings out the best in these 2 and serves as an antidote to the worst of those 2, right? And we'll kind of get at this as we come in the next few kind of slides in a way. Right, so we need experts, we need advocates, we need adversaries, we need people that are going to push the status quo and help us think out of the box and kind of push us the way things have always been done. So we need those, right? But if those dominate, those are the only voices we have, we've got a problem. So I could spend all day on this. Let's see where I am. But I'll touch on a few of these. But this is really coming from a communication perspective, right? Communication professor, on the fact that when we have overly adversarial political systems or engagement systems, we tend to have, right? You look at all the polls on trust in institutions and all those things, right? And some of the lowest part of it is the internet makes it so easy to gather around people that think like you, right? No matter how freaky you think, you can find a group on the internet that's just like that, right? That it's really easy to gather around like-minded, that it's created some negatives, right? So some of these I'll touch on. I mean, part of it is, do you ever ask during a campaign year why some of the ads are negative? You know, why so many ads are negative, political ads? They work. Right? They're effective, right? Well, a negative ad is always going to blame people, right? That the problem is this person, right? You know, so all the parties really have to do is just convince you the other side's worse, not that they have any good ideas, right? That creates communication that we're focusing on the negative and we're focusing on blaming, and we're getting away from anyone else taking accountability. We're getting away from adaptive change, right? One basic notion of wicked problems is the best way to deal with wicked problems is you have a broad range of factors, right? Yes, the school, but then the parents are critical, the community is critical, this, you know, they all need to kind of come together. When the dominant messages are the problem is this person, not, you know, I have a dog in a fight and it changes, right? The zero-sum game is basically a game that has inherently winners and losers, right? If someone wins, the other side automatically loses. And obviously Democrats and Republicans, that's how it works, right? And that creates these really weird incentive processes that incentivize bad communication. Anything good for one side is bad for the other side inherently, right? So if one side comes up with a really good idea, what does the other side have to say? You have to attack it. They can't let them have a good idea, right? So we're dealing with these really hard problems, and on top of that, we're putting this system that just changes all the incentive. So, you know, my background is communication professor. I'm basically an argumentation professor. Research how people make arguments and how they back them up and those type of things. And I can pretty confidently say we have a system that rewards bad arguments and punishes good arguments. And we need to change that. People that simplify things, people that attack motives and disrespect information win, right? And people that realize the difficulty of issues and want to kind of work through and figure that out are seen as weak, are seen as awful. We got to change that. Right. And the biggest problem with a zero-sum change, which I think really implicates when you're looking at district policy and things like that, is when people just mobilize and get the 51% and push something through and win, right? What does the 49% do? Do they say, okay, well, let's just work our hardest to make it work now? That would be great. But they don't, right? They're like, okay, now it was a horrible decision. They see it as illegitimate. They see it as kind of unfair. They tricked people. They manipulated people. So now they dedicate themselves to making sure it doesn't work and it changes as soon as possible, right? If we put so much focus on politics on the decision, the implementation is so much more important, right? And if the losers are always dedicated to making sure the implementation doesn't work, you know what? We just keep on, throw the bums out every 2 years, and just a cycle, right? We need more legitimate processes, so even the quote losers feel that they were heard, feel that they had input into the decision, right? Saw that their opinion was respected and incorporated into the decision, understood the opinions of others, so they understand the value of the decision. And maybe when they lose, they go, I don't think that's the right decision. But okay, so let's make it work. Right? Let's see how we can do this. And that's the biggest problem with the zero-sum game. It creates the lack of legitimacy. I've already talked about this. It plays into the flaws of human nature of us wanting to be simple. That's why we buy into it, right? We want that good versus evil frame. It's a lot easier than us struggling with it. And this is huge. It privileges organized and entrenched voices. I do a lot of work with school boards, right? And this is where they jump in. It's like, who comes to the microphone in a school board meeting, right? Or sends a letter to the editor or goes on the blog, right? People that say, man, y'all have a tough decision. I mean, on one hand, I see the value of doing this, but what the cost and trade-off? So I'm still struggling with that, but I hope you'll make a decision. No, right? They come in saying, it is so obvious you have to do this, you're an idiot if you don't. The next person, of course, says, if you do this, you're an idiot. You know, it is just an individual question. Because there's never any interaction. Most of our processes are designed for one at a time in the microphone, or one at a time sending an email, or one at a time sending a letter to editor, instead of those people actually coming to each other. So the only people that are going to talk are the ones, you know, and they might be right. I'm not saying they're wrong, but typically, you know, they're narrow. And you know, the squeaky wheel gets the grease kind of thing. So all this stuff creates polarization, cynicism, and apathy, gets people frustrated, right? And then that's a negative feedback loop, right? Because the people that disagree with you, you think they manipulated people and they cheated to win. Well, then that justifies you kind of manipulating people and cheating to win, right? So then like you manipulating people and cheating to win, it justifies them even doing more of it, which is, you know, and then all of a sudden it's all what you get. So how do we change that feeling? Similar way, expert-dominated politics. Experts are critical. I'm very pro experts and pro information, but experts can't make the toughest decisions for us. Experts can help us in every single one of those boxes, right? But experts can't tell us how to rank those boxes. Because we all want different things. I don't think, right? Experts can't say who's the most important group to kind of satisfy. Experts, by definition, the reason they're experts is they know a whole bunch about a little, right? Well, with a systemic problem, that doesn't work so well, right? We need there's no one expert that knows the whole system, right? So we need interaction and collaboration between experts. Experts, you know, coming from a university, most of the experts, they don't like studying values, right? Because you can't see a value, you can't count a value. It doesn't work very well to do a p-square with a value in one paper, right? So not only do they not look at values, but they don't look at the tensions between values. So again, lots of good data that we can get on empirical kind of, you know, stuff that we can really see, but that helps us make a decision about the big questions. That doesn't help answer the big questions, right? Experts are critical to laying out the choices we have in society. And the consequences of those choices, experts aren't good at making the choices for us. So that's kind of the shift. I already talked about a couple of these in here is experts' perspective. Yeah, so that's what I kind of talked about is inherently what's measured gets elevated, right? Which can sometimes be problematic, right? Wicked problems can be informed but not solved by data. I mentioned good data is undermined in a polarized environment. This is huge when I talk to experts, right? Because experts don't like public processes because the public just kind of has bad information and all this kind of stuff. And there's all these wonderful examples of, you know, a 10-year study by a group of 15 PhDs gets trumped by a 10-year-old with a good story and a tear rolling down their cheek, right? So experts get frustrated with the public, right? My response to it is, we don't do something about the over-polarized nature of our communication. In a polarized atmosphere, data doesn't matter, right? It's just ammunition, right? If it fits your perspective, you use it. If it doesn't, you ignore it or trash it, right? Just watch the debate. We're helping with kind of how to do marijuana policy in Fort Collins. Just watch the debate on there, and it was basically just a collection of, well, I have a study that says this, well, I have a study that says this, well, my study says, you know, and what do you do with all that? So how do we change our processes so data matters, right? So you help people understand the value of data and what's good and bad data. And then, probably most important, data doesn't have a strong record of changing behavior, right? Even if the experts figure it all out in the back of the room and kind of email it out, right, or have any policy, that's not going to change behavior with most of these issues. So the bottom line, we face serious issues, and then this is both within our schools, you know, we're trying to get better and better and better, right? But also outside the schools, and the schools are expected to kind of be the primary problem solver for most of our issues in our community, right? I've got one article, I can send it to John if people are interested, but doing some work with CASB, the Colorado Association of School Boards, and they sent this article about how much new stuff schools are expected to handle in the last few years, right? Like every decade, here's the 15 new things that schools are expected to. It used to be writing, reading, arithmetic, right? And then now it's just like everything, right? And I've actually been developing an article, I'm calling it Punting to K-12. And it's how many issues that I do outside of K-12 that the number one solution everyone wants is schools should do, right? And that's an avoiding of the wicked problem, right? We don't want to make people change their behavior, but clearly they need to change their behavior. We should just educate them so they make better choices on their own, right? So we're not violating freedom, right? But we get the, you know, so again, more and more on schools. So we got the problems. They don't have technical solutions, right? We're not just waiting for the eureka kind of, hey, we've solved it. Because they involve these paradoxes of competing values. They call for productive collaboration, innovation, and action, and we're not getting that from the current ways of talking to each other. The adversarial model, the expert model, plus the adversarial and expert model is blending now, right? We have conservative think tanks and progressive think tanks and things like that. So the line between advocate and expert is more blurry than ever. So into this comes this deliberative perspective. And the notion here, so this is kind of the definition that I give for the work. It's an approach to politics. Again, politics is broadly how we think about issues, how we make decisions together with citizens, not just experts and politicians. So we want experts and politicians or decision makers involved, are deeply involved in public decision making, often working with facilitators or process experts. This is not a requirement, but we just don't know how to talk to each other. So normally you need help, right? So that's the capacity that my center kind of provides, and we can develop the background material and have the students who are trained with that had a conversation. You know, this school district is building its own capacity, but then we also bring the students down here every once in a while to try to help. The city of Longmont gets this too, so they've got, you know, there's a lot of facilitators around here. Might be a role that you can consider playing as well, right? An issue that maybe you're not that passionate about the issue, then you can be a resource to kind of help have a conversation. We use a variety of deliberative techniques. There's a lot of ways of doing this. It's all based on, as we get into a little bit later, on interaction, right? It's typically rounds, people at a table talking to each other, not one at a time, talking to them back there. Citizens come together, consider relevant facts and values. So we need both. We need good data, right? But we also need to talk about values. I get sometimes it's like, you can't talk about values. Everyone's values are kind of individual, right? That's just not appropriate for conversation at the dinner table or whatever. We live together in communities, and our decisions inherently involve values and value dilemmas. We have to talk about them. So we have to figure out ways of talking about values from multiple points of view, and this becomes an important kind of burden for me, right? That if we're going to do this, we need voices to be heard. So part of I'm the impartial facilitator, right? But if I'm going to be democratic, right, I'm impartial about the issue, but I am partisan to democracy, which means I'm partisan to voices being heard and powerful, not shutting off the less powerful. Listen to one another, and this seems so obvious, right? A couple of different questions here. So, through all your schooling, right, whether it's just K-12 or gone to higher ed or whatever, how many classes have you taken that involved kind of you expressing yourself in something? Whether that was through writing or through speaking or through art or through interpretive dance, or you probably don't have enough fingers, right? Because at least once a year you had English, right? And you probably had. How many classes have you taken that focused on how to listen or how to ask good questions? Those are critical parts of this. And yeah, we normally have like one or two depending on your major in college, or something like that, right? Communication. So you take interpersonal communication. There's a chapter in textbook on listening, right? But mostly, and most of our processes are designed not to listen. Right? They're designed to give people a chance to express their opinion, which is huge. Expressing your opinion, getting voice, free speech, critical, right? If everyone's talking and no one's listening, you're not going to do much. And actually, people are going to get more frustrated, right? They'll make a decision that goes against what they said, and they say, "But didn't they hear me? I was there. I told them this was a bad idea." Right? So you can create more frustration if you let everyone speak, but then they don't get a sense of being heard, or they don't get a sense of hearing other people to see the tension, right? The quote I always give here is a quote from a New York governor that the art of listening in the United States is a competitive exercise in which the first person to take a breath is deep to listen. Right? That's how we listen when someone we disagree with, right? We listen to find a flaw, like something they could say that we jump on. Oh, actually, no, I've got a study that says, or we just looking for them to stop talking and take a breath so we can start talking. So how do we create processes why should listen to each other, right? Hopefully part of this is we want you to be advocates, you all have kind of issues you feel real passionate about, right? But also think about it, I just can't understand how someone can think that way, right? Instead of assuming they just must be a bad person, right? Say, maybe I should ask them some questions. Maybe I should really figure out, right? Because there's probably a lot more there. And then that gets reciprocated, right? You actually listen to someone, it's much more likely for them to listen to you. And all of a sudden you'll realize it's not as simple as you thought. Consider the underlying tensions, tough choices, and consequences. I've been talking about that already. Are willing to refine and adapt their opinions and interests. And this is a little, I assume when people come to a really good meeting, they're going to change their mind. I'm not designing it to change their mind. I'm not saying I want them to think me at the end, right? But I assume that they're probably coming in, seeing the issues kind of simply, and having a real good conversation with good material, having conversations with people they've never talked to before, honest, genuine, authentic conversation. They're going to have a lot of these moments that I'm talking about now as personal epiphanies. That's what I love when I run my meetings, seeing people go, really easy to demonize the school board, the superintendent, or the state legislature. Demonizing a fellow parent across the table, like when they're explaining why they care about something. I've seen that lots of times. Again, it's easier to put the blinders on, gather around people that think like us, talk about how right we are and how ridiculous they are, right? And then having a real conversation with they all of a sudden you like, see. So typically, a good process has to be people who want to improve their opinion, to see from different sides, to struggle more with it. And if it's one at a time in a microphone or if it's an interest group or something like that, you're shielding yourself from this. And ultimately, we want to come to action about judgment, which I'll talk about. So the article I passed around has like a paragraph on each of these. I won't talk about all 15, don't worry. But I'll touch on a few of them, and I'll bring this back up at the end if anyone wants questions. And I've inherently talked about a lot of these already. But I mentioned this a few times. This is again goes back to your school district getting it and being one of the national leaders in this work. But traditional engagement, typically, a lot of school districts inform their publics. Maybe part of that is also persuading them, right? It's called decide, announce, defend. Make a tough decision and then go out there and convince the public this is why it's good, right? Sometimes they're calling it decide, educate, announce, defend. I think it's the acronym DED. It doesn't work, right? If it's a complex, tough issue, right, people get angry. Then obviously most districts have some sort of input, whether that's microphone or school board meetings or all those types of things, right? And maybe they have some interaction, but city council and school district do the same thing. Is they don't want interaction back and forth with people at the microphone, right? That's when people start yelling at each other like that. So normally it's a whole bunch of input, right? And then the school board might react, right? The interaction, I think, happens more for school board members at the grocery store, those type of things, when someone walks up and starts talking. But you don't even get that much interaction. What we're talking about is designing processes of citizens talking to each other, right? So they're kind of engaging each other about these issues, and then that connects with the school district, but it also connects with all the other kind of keys. That's the conversation we need to be having, right? So how do we create that? How do we create capacity for that? How do we kind of broaden that? And just like the drawbacks of adversarial and expert, the drawbacks of deliberative, it takes a lot of time and it expects a lot of the public, right? It's envisioning the public as problem solvers versus the public just as customers or taxpayers, voters, projects, manipulation, or activists, those kind of things. But it goes back to democracy is hard. Right? And for democracy to work, we expect that a lot of the public to do. So I think I'll probably skip this. Well, I think I've already talked about these already. I want to make sure we have time for questions. But some of the advantages, it helps us take on the tough issues. Right? Even if the issue isn't politically advantageous, we talk about the issues we need to talk about, right? Which is important. It brings people together, which is critical for community. I'll talk about passion and partiality here in a second. And then rather than the negative feedback loop of adversarial, it creates a positive feedback loop, right? Because people start understanding each other, right? It's a huge move. The research shows that people don't change their mind that much. They don't switch from one side to the other. What they do is they change their mind about people they disagree with. They shift from, how did someone think that way, to, oh, makes sense. Right? I think my way still better than yours, but theirs makes sense. And that's a huge move for democracy. Right? I didn't put it on here. I normally have a sign from John Stewart that's, I disagree with you, but I'm pretty sure you're not Hitler. Right? That's kind of the move that we're trying to make, right? I think you're wrong. I don't think you're too wrong, right? And community works a lot better when you're at that level. But the disadvantages, like I mentioned, it is time consuming. It's countercultural, right? A lot more resources for adversarial, a lot more resources of, hey, let's gather in with people we agree and kind of push on. Expects a lot out of the public. Again, I'll talk about passion and partiality in a second. And it's, part of the problem is people really understand the complexity, then it's hard, right? It's a lot easier to show up when you're angry and it's good for people, right? Once you realize the tensions, so then that kind of puts the burden on us of how do we design the back end of processes that kind of keep people motivated, keep them interested, and see them kind of figure out how to negotiate these things. So I'm going to do a couple more concepts and then kind of more practical how it looks, and then we should have some time for questions. So as we're going through, one of the key concepts in there is the notion we care a lot about public opinion. Right? Public opinion is typically a pretty shallow, kind of narrow thing, right? some people haven't really thought about the issue as initial reaction. The way the question's worded is kind of huge, right? So a lot of the work that we do in the kind of literature talks about how do we move people from this kind of narrow, simplistic public opinion to public judgment. Public judgment is your opinion once you've really thought through all the different sides. You consider the consequences, both good and bad, intended and unintended. You consider the values of the opposing side. So again, how do we design processes so more people are going to have that opinion? And part of that is through the interactive communication of being people, what are processes that develop public opinion. So this is one of the main graphs that we use in our work, right? It's from Sam Kaner's guide, kind of cuts off here, the Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision Making. He talks about with any tough decision, any public decision making or group decision making, you need to go through 3 stages. So the first stage is you need divergent thinking, right? You need to get voices in the room. You need to, we're going to be democracy, those other things we need to worry about. Too often we cut things off, right? You probably all have examples in your families or your organizations or whatever, right? Where everyone seems to like the decision, you're like, sweet, this meeting's almost over, and then someone goes, well, yeah, but, oh no, right? The meeting's going to be longer now, right? We need those people, right? We need the devil's advocate. Or you've been in situations, the same thing. Everyone seems to like it, you hate it, but you're like, everyone likes it, I'm not going to say anything, right? So then you go with that, and then of course it bombs, and you're the first one to say, I knew it wouldn't work. But, so on their own, groups make really bad decisions. The part of it is we need good process to make sure we have diversity. Right? Part of the job, John's job in the school district, is to make sure they hear from everybody, not just the ones that show up at school, not just the ones that have the time to show up at things. Right? They need to. The public school, we honor all our public in lots of ways. Right? I think we kind of do a pretty good job here. There's certainly still kind of improvements to be made on certain voices, right? But I think the free speech tradition is so great. There's so many ways of providing input. We hear lots of voices, right? The problem is if we do a really good job of divergent thinking, but then don't have a way of dealing with all those voices, it gets messy. Again, you've all been in those meetings, right? That you let everyone kind of say, and then you're like, what do we do with this now? So that second stage, we call it working through the groan zone, is the critical stage. That's where you develop understanding. You let everyone talk. You have no mechanisms for engagement or understanding or discussion, right? You create false polarization. And that's kind of what I think we have now, right? People just don't understand each other. And they're frustrated because they got a chance to speak, and the decision goes against that, and they never spend any time really understanding the advantages of the decision, because they were so focused on the negatives, So that's the second, and this is again where this district is innovative in providing opportunities for this different kind of engagement, right? Not just voice. How do we get people to interact? The problem is you can do a really good job of this, then a really good job of this, and then you get stuck there. So there's a third set of processes for the conversion meeting. How do we start making decisions, right? We can't just talk forever, right? How do we kind of best negotiate those tensions? And that's a whole other kind of set. And part of what you're thinking about a school district is, in some ways, the design of representative government is we can't expect the people to do that, right? So we're going to elect our best and brightest, and they'll represent us, and they'll do the hard work. Ideally, that can still work. If you have good mechanisms for divergent thinking, that everyone gets voices, and then the rest of it is done by representative bodies, by the school board or whatever. The problem is there's a lot of distrust that isn't working, right? If people don't see the process. Right? Plus, the problem is if you need adaptive changes, if you need behavior change by the public, and they were involved in the process, then you get lost there, right? But it becomes a mix in a sense of who does each of these. Typically, this might be done by a smaller group. If you have a large enough group that goes through this and there's enough understanding, and all that understanding and all those ideas kind of feed into, what you think of these different things. Right? And the drawback is you can't have the whole community do this. Everyone can't go meeting every community, right? But how do you build up capacity, capacity in your community? They have more people going through this, so you don't just have specific voices. And with that leads, when you think about the back end, the inherent nature of wicked problems is there's not a policy solution. You're not going to pass a law that, boom, it does it. Right? You might pass a law that helps, but you think broadly about the action that might happen. And that's a lot of the work that we're doing now, is how do we create capacity for our communities. So yeah, school district is key, but then we also need nonprofits that are doing great work. We heard already about the foundation that's doing this, and then what's the role of private businesses kind of coming in and helping, and what's the role of parents kind of stepping up when there's all those things kind of come together. So how do we think, instead of just thinking about what's the policy, or just thinking about, okay, individuals just need to do it, there's a whole range. right? And with the organizations, obviously we have school districts in there, we have faith institutions in there, we have private institutions, but then we also have mechanisms for them to work together. Some really cool work that's being done now, just helping those groups coordinate, right? For years, a lot of nonprofit communities, a lot of silos, right? How do we organize that? Both have the innovation, creativity of those individual organizations, but also have some overall structure that helps align them in organizing. So last kind of key concept, it kind of draws from a few things I already mentioned earlier, but I developed this notion of passion and partiality a few years ago. And it's purposely an oxymoron, right? But the idea is, I'm passionate about my community, I'm passionate about solving problems, I'm passionate about democracy, but I believe, for me, I'm going to make more of an impact on my community by playing this impartial role, by focusing on process, by helping people have better conversations. Right? I developed it because I recruit students, and they apply to my program, so I get really high quality students. So it's really hard to really attract a really good student by saying, yeah, come to my program and you get to be a neutral facilitator, right? That just doesn't sound that great, right? So the notion of passion and partiality is, I think I'm making quite an impact on my community, right? I'm not picking what my community should be and pushing for that, but I'm pushing on how do we have better conversations. And I think in some ways, I trust the process, and the better conversations probably going to hand out what I believe in. Hopefully I deliberated and kind of we go to. But so I think that's part of what you kind of consider yourself on some issues, right? Not just kind of fighting for your individual perspective, but okay, let's fight for a good process, right? Because the better we have that conversation, the more voices we bring in, the better that will be handled. And then that leads to legitimacy. That leads to long-term, right? Instead of pushing through and just getting enough pressure on your principal so they make the decision that you want, right? How do you do a bigger process that you get everyone connected and struggling with that issue and do their different pieces? So the work that I do, when I train my facilitators, when I develop my materials and the processes and report them, I've got a commitment to impartiality. I need that to build a reputation that people trust us and to get past the polarization and come in and feel they have to trust the process. Right? But at the same time, I have to honor equality and inclusion. I train my facilitators if someone is getting shut out of the conversation to make moves to open that up. Right? I try to train my facilitators that if there's 8 people at the table and they all think one way, the facilitator has to be the devil's advocate, right? And bring in new voices to help them struggle with that. But when they do those type of things, they're violating a pure form of impartiality. Right? They're not neutral, right? Because we have these commitments to democracy. Or the same thing, if we have to honor the importance of the data. If one person has really good information, the other person's just kind of making stuff up, which happens a lot in our meetings. Right? We've often got the talking points that someone will get up, and then we read that, and it's just bad information, right? Or at least maybe not out and out lies, but clearly kind of framed in a very strategic way to convince people. Right? And if we're neutral, in the face of good information versus bad information, well, we're serving that information. That part of it, so important data still plays a role. It's not a simplistic reality. So the application with this, I've been trying to do that as we go. But part of it is, when I say throughout the cycle, I didn't do the cycle thing part today, but it's throughout the whole process, right? A lot of, when you're engaging people deliberatively, you're engaging them earlier. The old school way is the school district or the city or whatever will identify the problem, study the problem, experts will identify potential options of the problem, develop criteria to kind of rank those options, present it to the district kind of picks the best option, then they engage the public. And when that happens, what's the only thing the public can do? Is either like the thing, right? If they like the decision, are they going to show up at the meeting? No, but that's a good decision, right? Front page in newspapers, right? If they don't like the decision, they show up, right? So most public process is angry people yelling at the decision makers, right? So deliberative process is you start earlier. You engage the people with the problem. You know what? We have a problem, right? And you help the people help define the problem and understand the problem. You have the people help them develop the approaches to it. And so if you do that from the beginning to the end, then whatever the decision makes, there's much more legit. They understand the problem. How often has there been a decision announced all of a sudden to solve a problem that the public didn't even know about the problem in the first place, right? And there's no way they can understand the wickedness of the problem and intentions. And the old school way is to find the solution based on the values that the decision supports. Not, and you go positive, right? These are all the wonderful things we're doing. You don't say, yeah, but on the other side, it's this, right? That's not enough to get our way. And that's what creates the distrust. Right? People say, hey, what all the trade-off? How much is it going to cost? What about the So when you engage people earlier and they see the different sides, they have much more ownership. Right? So you can help the community identify and work through those problems, work against the negative consequences of adversarial politics. When you have those conversations waiting to pick up your kids at elementary school and someone's scouting off for you in a very simple way, right? Even if you agree with their perspective, say, well, you know, you've got to think about the other state. Go out of your way to kind of have conversations with people that disagree with. Ask them good questions, figure out what they're thinking. And then be part of that to elevate the level of conversation. Take responsibility for the quality of the communication around you. And then working to improve the interaction. You know, we're asking the district when we're trying to do these processes. You know, what year is this now, John? It's like fifth or sixth year of this? Fifth year of this, right? You know, we've got a couple hundred parents that have gone through this, right? What a great resource for the district when they're treating on a tough issue. To have not just, you know, again, the privileging and entrenched voices of adversarial politics. Normally, the only people that show up at the meeting are the people that have a strong opinion, right? We need people that show up at the meeting that have a strong opinion about the quality of good decisions, and to be a part of that. That's hopefully what you can do as you go forward.